Hi, this is Joe Hage. I have the privilege of leading your medical devices group, which, as of this recording, has 337,000 members worldwide. And one of the reasons we've been so successful is we have members like Peter Argondizo in the group who are willing to share their knowledge with the group. Today we're going to be talking about translating medical device documentation. And I have to let you know that Peter was my translator when I was at Cardiac Science a few years back. He won an RFP among 22 vendors, so he's been very carefully vetted, even for this webinar, and it's my privilege to introduce you to my friend Peter. Take it away. Have a good show.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you very much for inviting me to present, and thank you to everyone for joining us. My goal today is basically to help you have good conversations with your translation vendor. We hope to arm you with the right questions, the right things to discuss. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of the points that you should be considering when choosing a translation vendor. Now, these next few bullets, I call them permission to play attributes. In other words, if your vendor isn't talking about these things, then it might be a good idea to look elsewhere, especially in this environment with medical devices. So I would look a little bit at longevity. I think it's tough. Admittedly, we were a new upstart translation firm about 21 years ago, but I don't know that you want to necessarily gamble. The risks are high, right? When when we were doing translations for Joe, we were working on defibrillators. It doesn't get much riskier than that, right? So I would look at longevity. How long has the firm been in business, or at a minimum, how long has the key staff been in this world? I would also look at quality initiatives, and I think all too often initiatives like ISO 9001, now 2015, and ISO 17100, the replacement for the EN 15038, are looked at as lip service. There are many, let's say, of our colleagues that are in the translation world that really just go ahead and do this only to get the piece of paper, only to be able to have the conversation. I think if you talk to your vendor a little bit about their QMS, what does their quality management system look like? What does their quality assurance manual look like? Dig in and learn a little bit about how they run their quality program, and I think you'll learn if it's lip service or they really are getting some benefit out of the quality initiative and how that works in your favor. I would also look at process. I think all too often we sort of gloss over the fact, because we all do things similarly in the sense that we have a translator, we have an editor, there's a quality check after that. There might be desktop publishing and another quality check, but really dig down deep and understand what steps your vendor is following to complete your translation. Also look at industry experience. If you're looking at a vendor that predominantly works in manufacturing and it's just all heavy equipment and it has nothing to do with medical devices, well, you might want to think twice about that. Also look at translation memory management. Make sure, and at this point of the game, I would say most firms are using translation memory, but double check that. Make sure that they're using it. Make sure that any matches or repetitions are used for the benefit of you as the client. So sort of going down a little bit deeper, these are more the things that I think are the true differentiators when you're looking at vendors. Talk a little bit about transparency and pricing. All too often, we've heard from prospective clients that they're getting, they have a 20-language project and they're getting basically a one-line item estimate. It doesn't really have an explanation of the steps that are followed. It doesn't have a breakdown by language. You should really dig down and look at the sub-data. In other words, how many repetitions am I getting? How many 100% matches am I getting? And this might make a little more sense when we talk about translation memory, but really understand where the discounts are coming from and ask, since most of you also have software that goes along with your device, you should be asking, what are my updates going to look like? So in other words, when I update this piece of software and all the documentation that goes along with it, what is my pricing going to look like? How will that work? And also try to understand if you're getting honeymoon pricing. That's also a very common thing that translation vendors will do, is they'll put in samples with high quality translators and then merely fill in sort of the B team, let's call them the JV, the junior varsity, and also increase their prices. You want to make sure that, again, if you have full transparency, there's nowhere to hide. So there is no ability to do honeymoon pricing. You would see an effort to increase pricing. And again, if there's transparency in reporting in terms of who's handling your translation, whether it be vendor codes or whatever piece of data you can use to determine that this was my Spanish translator, this was my Spanish editor, that no one's trying to pull a fast one on you.
Peter, is there really a way to avoid honeymoon pricing? I mean, that's a great way to get someone to sample you, and then when they feel that, well, of course we're going to use Peter, you have a relationship that you can start taking pricing.
Definitely. So if the proposals are done in such a way where you can see the detailed data, you'll get sort of data on the gross cost per word and what the net cost per word is. And that's when you'll truly see if someone's trying to pull a fast one on you. If they're giving you that very vague estimate where they're essentially just giving you one line item and you have no way of determining, gee, what am I paying for the Spanish and what are my discounts for the reps? If that transparency is lacking, it's incredibly easy to use a honeymoon pricing strategy where they can just increase the costs on you. In other words, what they're doing.
So would you advise that? Oh, okay. Michelle is asking the same question I was going to ask you. Is there a standard price per word?
Not really.
Like, should you have each of the vendors you're considering submit what their price per word is and then choose the cheapest one?
I think there's actually for those of you that registered, I think you received that RFP form, that sample RFP form, and one of the questions I include in that sample RFP form is to ask your prospective vendors to give you pricing on a project with X amount of words, X amount of repetitions, X amount of 100% matches, X amount of fuzzy matches. I think the better question is to take a couple sample projects and give those to your vendors and say, show me pricing on this. And that's where you're fully understand. Because I think also when we're trying to communicate to procurement and to our managers, price per word is such a nebulous thing that it doesn't mean a whole lot. So yes, I think it's important information to understand, but I think the more important piece is to say, gee, I gave them a spec sheet, I gave them an IFU, I gave them a manual, I gave them a standard help project, and this is where the pricing came back. And now you can truly compare apples to apples. So I would say the price per word is important, but I would also look at that cost in the context of a project.
Makes a lot of sense, and while you were speaking, I pushed out that link for the RFP to the audience, so they might be looking at it now while you're talking. Thank you.
Great, wonderful. Great question, by the way. Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Michelle. The workflow, and I think this is also important. Again, under the fact of this lack of transparency that sometimes happens in quoting in the translation industry, you really want to understand, and it goes hand in hand with what you're buying. There are some agencies out there that are doing machine translation as a first pass and then doing human editing as a second pass. I'm not a huge fan of that approach. Some people do it with success, and I think that's fine. But my beef with that, or my issue with that, is that the client should know. The client should understand that this is machine translation as a first pass with human editing. So you are fully armed with comparing that to other vendors. And I think it's incredibly important that you understand what the workflow is. What steps are included in the process? What exactly am I paying for as a buyer? And I think that's also going to help you compare apples to apples. And I think most good translation vendors can modify their approach. And gosh, if there's a budgetary concern and you don't want 2 QA passes, well, okay, that's fine, do that, but do it with eyes wide open and understand what the risks are. So there is inherently a risk in doing machine translation with human editing. And we could do an entire webinar on that topic, and we'd get all sorts of questions and probably a bit of vitriol from either side. So let's not go there, but just understand that to really truly compare apples to apples, you have to understand what steps are included. And also, how do they select their linguists? So who's working on my project? Are they properly reporting to you? And I know many of you have this requirement, and certainly Joe and his group at Cardiac Science had that requirement, is that they needed to understand who is working on the projects from project to project. That was really in their SOP. So we would have to provide vendor codes. This was the Spanish linguist, this was the Spanish editor. Is that being provided? How large is the team? So if I get very busy as a buyer, how will you address that if you only have a team of 2? Is my team really going to be four people, and is there going to be some cross-checking? How are you going to mitigate the inconsistencies that can happen in a large project? So those are all very important points in choosing your vendor.